field who spanned all of its various facets. I'm sure that all of you have been in a ton of Zoom meetings and know the following protocols, but I want to take a moment to go over the specific protocols for this evening's event. First, very importantly, in order to be recorded as an attendee and to receive certification for this course, please type your full name into the chat, and you can do that now. Only those of you who sign in will receive certification for the credits for this course. So again, if you would like to get credit for this course, I see some of you are typing your full name in, which is great. Please type your full name in now. As you can see, your microphone is on and you're muted in this event. And it is up to you if you'd like to keep your camera on. If you would like to keep it off, that is also up to you. I wanted to encourage you to write questions throughout the event. So we have some planned questions for our panelists, but there will certainly be time for them to discuss your questions throughout the panel, and we'll be using them to inform the discussion. And we will also be having some time for a Q&A at the very end of the session. So if you are thinking of questions along the way, please do write them in the chat, or you can write them in at the very end of the session. About 15 minutes before the session is over, we will also be launching a very brief poll to get your feedback on the session. And it will take no time at all, and we'd love for you to take some time to do that. The goals for this evening are to hear from this panel about the specific challenges that their work is facing in light of the COVID pandemic and how that's impacting the heritage and preservation fields, specifically in New York City, as well as to hear their thoughts on some strategies to mitigate the effects of this pandemic and what the future might hold for our cultural institutions, community anchors, and residents as we move forward in this time. I'm confident that the discussion will be a robust one. And again, we very much encourage you to ask your questions, and we hope to get to as many of them as we can. Just a couple of words about who's sponsoring this program this evening. So a lot of the people on this panel are actually affiliated with Pratt Institute's Historic Preservation Program. Either they're faculty there, or they're an alumnus, or even both. And so I want to mention a couple of words about this particular program, which is to say that it's housed in the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment in the School of Architecture at Pratt Institute. And it's a 2-year master's degree program that trains preservationists to be in the skills they need to uplift and preserve community culture, historic sites, and heritage. And we encourage any of you who would like more information about Pratt's Historic Preservation Program to please reach out to Vicki Weiner, the head of the program, whose email is here on this slide. So we're going to just go ahead and launch our panel because that's what we're here to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about myself. So I'm a professor in the Historic Preservation Program at Pratt. I'm also an alumnus of the Historic Preservation Program, but I'm also the co-founder and director of an organization called the Urban Memory Project, which is an education organization that partners with teachers and students and community organizations to consider the issues that are facing our city and the places that matter to people who live in the city, and to document those places through oral histories, photo documentation, field visits, and then to share that work back to the public. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my partner in developing this panel, Chris Cirillo, and he will introduce himself.
Thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca said, my name is Chris Cirillo. I'm really excited to be on the panel this evening and co-moderating with Rebecca. Rebecca and I were both students in the Historic Preservation Program at Pratt and now both teach in the program. And so we have a great panel lined up for you this evening. A little bit more about me. When I'm not teaching at Pratt, I am the executive director at Ascendant Neighborhood Development Corporation, which is a nonprofit organization based in East Harlem that preserves and develops affordable housing. And in recent years, we've become much more heavily involved in historic preservation work in East Harlem and the broader Northern Manhattan community, in part through our work with Landmark East Harlem. an alliance of local residents, business owners, and organizations working to protect the East Harlem community. So Rebecca and I conceived of this panel as we were co-teaching a course this semester called Current Issues in Historic Preservation. We were teaching this 5-week course, and 3 weeks into it, the pandemic hit, and we suddenly were teaching remotely and trying to navigate for our historic preservation students what the future of preservation looks like, not just the current issues, but this very current issue of how we navigate the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on preservation, and what the future of preservation looks like. And so working with Vicki and others at Pratt and Brooklyn AIA, developed this great panel of folks who are going to introduce themselves now and then answer some questions about how the pandemic is currently impacting their work and their thoughts about the future of preservation and what we all can do to ensure that preservation is a key piece of rebuilding after the pandemic. So first, I'd like to introduce Lisa Ackerman, who, in addition to being a Pratt faculty member, is currently the executive director of the Columbus Citizens Foundation.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Rebecca. Well, I am also both a faculty member at Pratt and a graduate from the program. My day job is being the executive director of Columbus Citizens Foundation, which is a 75-year-old organization devoted to Italian American heritage, and we run a scholarship program that supports about 700 deserving students a year. But I think, my biggest preservation challenge at the moment is I'm chair of Historic House Trust, which is an ensemble of 23 houses that sit on City Parks land and are open to the public and largely serve school groups. And so, I'm thinking about preservation in that way all the time. And then up until just 6 months ago, I had spent 12 years at World Monuments Fund thinking about preservation activities worldwide. So, I come to this panel with a lot of, complicated thoughts about where we're going, and happy to share my thoughts and learn from others tonight.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Next up is Molly Garfinkel, the director of City Lore's Place Matters program.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me on this panel and spending the evening with us. So as Chris said, I am the director of City Lore's Place Matters program. And City Lore was founded in 1985. It's what we call a cultural conservation nonprofit. And our mission is really to foster New York City, and by extension, America's living cultural heritage through education and public programs. We primarily document, present, and advocate for New York City's grassroots cultures to enable their living legacy and stories, histories, places, and traditions. And our work really spans roughly four departments. So urban folklore, public history and historic preservation, which is what Place Matters sort of covers, in-school and out-of-school time arts education, and community-based poetry and language traditions. And so in each of these, we really try to further cultural equity and model a better world with projects as dynamic and diverse as New York City itself. And the Place Matters program is a 22-year-old initiative that was initially founded with the Municipal Art Society that celebrates and advocates for places that the public finds significant. So it's really meant to be a publicly sourced resource for understanding what sense of place is and what the kinds of places that people care about, most of which are publicly accessible places, but not exclusively. And these are really the ones that hold memories, anchor traditions, and help to tell the history of New York. And a lot of what we do is oral history based or has a sort of cultural arts focus, but not entirely. And a lot of what we do also supports organizations that have culture at their foundation, but don't necessarily think of themselves as cultural organizations. So I'll talk about that in just a bit.
Great, thanks, Molly. And next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Zulma Lena Then, the founder of Preserve East New York.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here. I founded Preserving East New York in 2015 in response to Mayor de Blasio's rezoning proposal, and what triggered founding the organization was the demolition of a beloved historical building. So in thinking about, the changes that would come with the rezoning, I was inspired to create an organization to bring awareness to our community, a community of color that sometimes, we're often don't know the process of, the municipal process of landmarking. So I wanted to create an environment where we would come together and fight for the special places of our community.
Great, thank you. And next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Simeon Bankoff, the Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. Simeon?
Oops. Sorry.
Did we lose Simeon?
Yep. And did we go ahead and introduce Angel?
Sure. Okay, so while we get Simeon back, I will jump ahead and introduce Angel Ayón, the principal architect at Ayón Studio Architecture and Preservation.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. My name is Angel Ayón. Thank you so much also to Pratt's Historic Preservation Program for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm the principal of Ayón Studio, an architecture and historic preservation firm where we deal with existing buildings, mostly historic buildings throughout the city. This kind of heroic looking selfie that is on my slide, it's me at the rooftop of the Nighthawk Prospect Park, one of the projects we've been working on lately. And we do work throughout the city and beyond on primarily historic buildings, and that's the core of the practice, which is based in Union Square. But way before I started doing the work that I do at Ayón Studio, I've been for the last 20 years an advocate for historic preservation in the city, but primarily in Harlem, where literally 20 years ago right now, in 2000, I became involved with the effort to save the Fire Watchtower in Marcus Garvey Park, a project that eventually became a community effort that went way beyond my contribution and resulted in the reopening of the Watchtower last fall, after a $7.5 million restoration. And in addition to that, I'm also more recently the author of a new book on conservation of modern architecture called Reglazing Modernism, Intervention Strategies for 20th Century Icons, where we talk about different approaches for the conservation, rehabilitation, and replacement of modern. So I'm very happy to be here and sharing my thoughts and with everyone in this panel.
Great, thank you.
I can't believe they're dropping this case, babe.
And then I got another video when I sent that little image I sent to my sister-in-law, just sort of like, yeah, just get it, like it's gonna go.
Somebody's on a beat.
Are you with us?
From a guy like sort of.
Yes, I'm here.
Now we're going to hear from
What was it like?
Yeah.
Bankoff.
So like whenever.
Can you hear me? All right, let's try this again. Hi. Organization, citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We've been around, our principal, forgive me, I'm a little tumbled. We work through 3 basic program areas, serving a constituency of over 500 neighborhood-based groups. Those program areas are direct advocacy, educational outreach, and I can't be unmuted. Am I unmuted or muted?
You're unmuted.
Cool, thank you. Educational outreach and community, and working directly with the community. We do a lot of things. This is an old picture of all of us sort of demonstrating in front of City Hall on as a community outreach, as well as doing a direct advocacy in an attempt to get more money for the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I'm going to stop talking now, but I will talk a lot later. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with my old colleagues from Pratt. I also was a graduate. I was in classes with both Rebecca and Chris, and Lisa was one of my teachers, as was Vicky.
Great, thanks, Simeon. And now we're going to launch into some questions for our panelists. And we're going to turn to each of them to address the same two questions. So the first question that we'd like each of you to answer is, how has the pandemic shaped your work? And what are the impacts that you're seeing currently in your preservation work? And we're going to start again with Lisa to lead off.
Well, I think everybody is facing the same challenges. We had to all very abruptly go to a digital mode and offsite working. I think in my Columbus Citizens Foundation, it was a fairly easy transition to move the staff to a virtual existence. I think, in terms of my chair as Historic House Trust, that was a much more complicated dance, because with 23 properties open to the public, while they serve a general public, school groups make up a very high percentage of the 700,000 to 800,000 people a year that visit the houses collectively. So I think the impact right now is not so much the here and now as the uncertainty of when will things reopen. And so I think how it's influenced us is everybody is trying to be nimble and accommodating, but you can do that a lot easier when you know the time horizon. So I think I'll leave it for my colleagues to answer, but I think that how it's affecting us right now is you can do a lot virtually, but when you are responsible for physical properties, you still have ongoing responsibilities at those properties. Just to give one quick example before I sign off, is that one of the Historic House Trust houses is Queens County Farm Museum. So you can close the physical building, but you still have animals to care for and horticultural responsibilities and agricultural activities. So, the shutdown means many things to many different institutions, and we're all struggling a bit to understand that.
Great, thanks. And now I'm going to ask Molly to address the same question.
Yeah, so in my recent work, I've been engaged with a project that we're calling Community Anchors. Rebecca mentioned this sort of term. And it's an ongoing research, a qualitative research study that explores the value, impact, and sustainability of cultural and artistic networks that thrive in what we've sort of determined as three organizational typologies. So religious institutions, small businesses, and social clubs, all of which have a spatial sort of component that's very important to the work that they do and the ways that they engage with community. And all of these typologies play key roles in community life and well-being. And particularly at this moment of really unprecedented anxiety, economic upheaval and isolation, when communities and individuals around the globe are separated from the people and places that they love and rely upon, we feel that the need to understand and protect these kinds of places takes on added importance and meaning. So the study, which is ongoing and started in New York City in 2015 and has expanded to, at present, 4 other cities across the country, really is started as documentation, and now we're sort of refocusing some of that attention on the ways in which these community anchors have responded to and are being affected by the pandemic. So all of these sort of key typologies, religious institution, social club, and small business, sort of represent the three main pillars of community life: the spiritual, the social, and the economic. And a lot of them are hybrid entities, both in terms of their business development plans and in terms of the ways that they engage with community life. They all provide neighbors with services as well as opportunities for civic participation and support, and significantly a sense of belonging that's really culturally specific. And a lot of the community anchors included in this investigation have culture at the core of their work, even if they don't self-identify as an arts group. And we think of this as what sort of Tulane professor of anthropology, Nick Spitzer, who's also the host of a radio program called American Roots, thinks of as cultural first responders. So these kinds of places, again, they're places with bricks and mortar locations that people gather in, suggest sort of an alternative definition of essential services. And right now we're looking at how these cultural communities across the nation are understanding and categorizing essential businesses, workers, and programs before the crisis, and we'll be looking at this again after. And we're also thinking about how to sustain these kinds of essential services. So despite the extremity of this experience, we think that these collective environments and shared cultural experiences are really critical to community conservation. And right now we're trying to better understand the nature of the challenges faced by these groups, both directly related to the pandemic and then also related to philanthropy and community support systems, and just general overall sustainability. So now that we're sheltering in place, it's very hard to know how people are actually engaging with the space, but we're interested also in how they're engaging with these sort of informal networks. And what cultural and social cohesion can come out of doing this all through Zoom, and the idea that people will be going back to places that are losing irreplaceable sources of income. And many of them struggle to keep the lights on before, and now it's a question of whether they'll be able to open the doors again at all. And we're also looking at how they are using culture and these networks to help mitigate psychological trauma related to the pandemic, and how they're building community resilience for the future. So it's an issue of adapting to shifting realities, and also thinking about some of these as very vulnerable typologies and businesses and institutions, local landmarks, if you will, before the pandemic, what role they're playing now, and then what that will look like after.
Great, thanks. And now I'd like to pose the same question to Zilmelina. How has the pandemic shaped your work?
Zilmelina, you might be muted. You might need to unmute.
Okay, sorry. So for preserving East New York, well, I'm gonna say that, during this time that we have all, have to stay inside, technology has been on our side, but unfortunately, for preserving East New York, a lot of our work happens offline. So, a lot of our mission is to educate people about, what is preservation and why is it important to our community, and the way that we bring about this messages through our events and our outreach, and it's in person, face to face. Our community, works from that energy of coming together and engaging to create, a better place, neighborhood. It happens face to face. So, our tours, our events, to engage our people to come together and connect with historic preservation in a meaningful way, during this time is impossible. So, that's one of it's like a major setback for us, because right now preservation is not in is not a priority at the moment. So we have to take a back seat and kind of focus on other things that has affected our community. And as we all know, communities of color have been impacted tremendously by COVID. So preservation right now has to take a step back in our neighborhood so that we can focus on these major priorities like health and jobs, you know. So it's unfortunate, but you know, right now we're looking at ways into how to move forward, you know. What does that look like for us at the moment?
Great, thanks, Melina. And now if we can pose that same question to Simeon, how has the pandemic shaped your work at the Historic Districts Council?
It's really altered a number of different elements for us. From the point of view of operating a small not-for-profit business, we took an immediate hit with regards to both our fundraising and our basic schedule that we had planned out. This is our 50th year, and we had a very ambitious and robust series of programs that we were going to be running, and that had to be kind of, let's just say, retooled quite quickly. And we're actually at this point reinventing and reinvigorating some of these things, but that took a lot of thought and to try to figure out. On my more sort of existential level, a lot of what HGC does is act as a network and as kind of a fulcrum point for a whole network of community groups to meet. And genuinely, there's actually no real difference from me talking to somebody from my house in Brooklyn than to me talking to somebody from my office in the East Village. But there is an emotional barrier, both from ourselves, you know, you're used to being in a certain place and we're all place-based people, to also trying to engage with community members who have, as Zumelina said, other things on their mind, and trying to engage with those communities who are the basis for all of our work, who are the principal constituencies and the principal recipients of our work, has been really difficult from that point of view, because you call up people and they've got other stuff going on, and they have, they're just, especially during the first couple of weeks of New York Pause, everyone was sort of laboring under a generalized anxiety that just didn't really want to make them talk about the intricacies of what's going on with the Landmarks Preservation Commission. One of the nice things, actually, is that LPC, the Landmarks Commission, has started doing online meetings, and that has given a certain focus, once again, to our work that enables us to move forward. But one of our principal programs, the 6 to Celebrate program, we work with 6 different community-based campaigns, and we do that by checking in with people on a regular basis, and they're just like, hey, I can't talk about this right now, or and just gets.
I think we might have lost a little bit of Simeon there.
Should we go to Angel?
Yeah, I think we'll seem to be having some sound issues with Simeon, so we'll move on to Angel. As a practicing architect and preservationist, please, you know, answer the same question. How has the pandemic been affecting your work?
First, I think I would be remiss not to mention that the first impact is at a very personal level, when you have to not only you have to combine working from home with homeschooling, and as a parent, it's just been an amazing trajectory for me and my wife to have to deal with that. if I could put the business side of it aside for a minute, it's just been one of the most remarkable challenges that have marked our existences within the last few weeks. And I see that there are 100+ people in this event, so probably many of you are sharing the same things. And so this is the very first personal impact that this thing has on us. Fortunately, at the office, we are a small business. We have a variety of projects where we concentrate not only on dealing with exterior work, but we also have renovation work on buildings. But the first impact that from a business perspective is just that a lot of the work came to a stop. That very same project where I took that epic selfie with the skyline in the background, at the Nighthawk, we were just getting ready for a second round of work after the building conversion had been completed and the building open and so on. And I'm assuming everyone is familiar with what this is. This is the movie theater on Prospect West. And when we were just literally ready to start installing the sidewalk shed to proceed with exterior repairs, this thing came up, and I had to take the call from my client at the Nighthawk, who was, Angel, do I need to do this? Can we do this? What are we going to do? And said, look, I read the New York Times about you and your movie a couple of days ago, where you had to literally shut down the movie and just let everybody go. So no, this had to stop. This had to wait. So we have a variety of projects like this that we were just planning to start doing construction, and they have to simply stop. And that was extremely unfortunate. We are lucky that we are a small practice, and we have other types of projects. So we have a variety of projects that have been going through DOB approval, an LPC approval, and those have been moving. We have other interior design projects and adaptive reuse projects that have taken up within these last few weeks. We've been able to concentrate on those, especially one building conversion in Long Island City to a performance space, which is a really exciting project. So we've been lucky in that front, that we've been able to survive and thrive. I think as a small firm, we're more flexible in that sense. I do know, however, that other firms have to take more serious steps, and you know the news about terminations and so on. So I'm really happy and proud that we didn't have to do that. We've been able to retain employment for our employees and even bring in new people because we needed to process. And we've been able to do that in the last few weeks to work on some of those projects. And I think from the advocacy perspective, and I think the work through a lot of the work that I do, which is through Save Harlem Now, a not-for-profit organization based in Harlem. That just as Milena said, I mean, it's no secret to everyone that this pandemic has had a significant impact on communities of color. So there's a state of shock. It's pretty much what Cirillo was talking about earlier, where the guards are low and the people are really focusing on survival. The news are not good. What you read on the press and what you hear in the neighborhood, it's tough. We're losing the elders, and in some cases we're losing the leaders. So it's a shocking time from a community advocacy perspective these days, because the impact that this has had on people, and especially people who were very vulnerable in underserved communities like Harlem and so on. So I think this is one that it will be remembered for that, and where there have been winners and losers, and I think that those who have taken a major hit where those communities were where the resources were not there and where the challenges had always been steep. So in a nutshell, that's where we are at.
Great, thank you. And now we're going to move into the second question that we'd like each of the panelists to address, which is, what do you imagine the future will be like for your work specifically, and also more broadly the preservation field. And so again, we're going to go through all the panelists, and then after this, open it up for a broader conversation among the panelists. But I'll turn it over to Lisa to address the question of what you imagine the future will be like for your work and for the preservation field.
You know, I think for the future, and I preface this by saying I'm a very positive person, and I, very much believe that we're, resilient. I think in the near term, we have a lot of challenges. Nonprofit cultural world is that we've spent 30 years telling nonprofits they have to stand on their own. They have to figure out how to deal with earned income. They have to broaden their programming. And I think many institutions were succeeding at that, but it was all very much based on a sort of volume through the door. And so it's going to be very difficult for some institutions to retool themselves. And I've been on a number of calls in the last few days where people representing nonprofit theater groups, for instance, have said not only did they have to suspend their spring and summer programming, but they're not certain what the fall is going to look like. So for many people, that need to figure out what the alternatives are when you can't earn income in the way you have. So I fear a little bit for the streetscape of the city. And I know we're not the only city harmed by COVID-19, but I live here in New York City. And so, I'm thinking about what life in the 5 boroughs is going to be like. And for me, preservation has always very much been about the here and now, not just preserving the past, but I think about when we do reopen, what is our streetscape going to look like? How many people have been able to hang on during this period? So for me, preservation is just as much the buildings and the Historic House Trust family as it is the nail salon and the barber shop and the small grocery store and the locally owned businesses. And so I think one of my greatest fears in the near term about what preservation is going to look like is, how is our community collectively going to have weathered a very complicated economic period? And, many of us depend on 1 or 2 significant events a year to earn unrestricted income. And that's often what pays our salaries and keeps the light bulbs on. And, if you have to miss those significant events, some institutions will easily transition to let's have our gala via Zoom, and other institutions are going to have a tougher time. And I think, we may find ourselves in the preservation field where small institutions that have always done everything on a shoestring may survive because they're used to survival mode, and very large institutions, you don't necessarily worry about them if they have short-term economic troubles, they come out of it. But it's those medium-sized institutions that may struggle the most in this. And that, that worries me a lot, because that's the richness of the field, is that it's not dominated only by big players, but there's a lot of local neighborhood preservation activities. And, I think that, when somebody looks back 25 years from now, this will be a blip. But if you're living through that blip, I feel that there's some well understood anxiety about what the next, year or two are going to look like here in the city. And so I think everybody is pulling together in positive ways, which is helpful, and a lot of good communication between institutions. In terms of my day job, I'm in a 125-year-old building every day, where it's a lot of the activities are based on bringing people into that townhouse and welcoming them for events. And, a lot of our charitable support comes from having cultivated a group of several hundred people that loyally support us. So even I think about, will people feel that same cultural tie if we're not seeing each other in person a lot? So, you know, I don't think I'm having a different experience than anybody else, but certainly I'm thinking very much from a preservation point of view, how is this going to affect our streetscape, and what can we do to try and encourage as much investment in local activities as possible.
Great, thanks. And now, Molly, if you could address that question
Sure.
yourself.
Can you guys put my slide?
Sure. Yeah. Just give me a sec.
Use the sites in it. Okay, so just thinking ahead, I'm just going to talk through 3 places sort of representing these 3 typologies that we're talking about, which are by no means the limit of the kinds of places City Lore and Place Matters works with, but very representative. So on the bottom left is the annual Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which has taken place in Williamsburg, Brooklyn since 1903. The festival includes a tradition of the 82-foot Giglio Tower lift and carry. And it's been canceled this year for the first time in 75 years. And it's an important celebration and cultural and spiritual and economic underpinnings, and is an economic driver for the parish, which really relies on income from this event, this weekend-long event, to stay afloat. It's a critical revenue stream for them. On the top is the St. Anne's Block Association Garden in the Melrose neighborhood of the Bronx. The garden was established in 1995, and it's one of a very large number of community gardens that still exist in the Bronx, but are, you know, as with community gardens across the city, always under threat. This is a place where friends and neighbors gathered in the nice weather to hang out, to play dominoes, to grow fresh food, to practice cultural traditions. And it's a largely Puerto Rican membership, so there are very specific cultural traditions that are practiced there and foods that are grown. And on the bottom is the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is one of the city's most famous poetry venues. The Lower East Side has long been home to artists and revolutionaries, and is famous for its many generations of immigrant communities and artist activists. And the cafe first opened in September 1974 to provide a forum for the voices of the many poets living in the Lower East Side who weren't necessarily invited to other spaces. And it was an effort to broaden the audience and appeal for poetry, as well as the types of poetry and the types of ideas that were being spoken about. Class issues and themes of political nature influenced a lot of the poetry. A lot of the writers were involved with the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, protests against the Vietnam War. So a lot of intersectionality here as well. And the cafe is, of course, currently closed due to coronavirus. Some of the programs, like open mics, have gone online, but as with many businesses and other places that rely on ticket sales and bodies through the door, and many other small arts organizations and small entities, the closure is a huge financial blow. And so since New York City has closed all non-essential businesses, again, it's the idea of what is essential. The staff of all these 3 kinds of typologies and the people who steward these places have put in marathon efforts to stay afloat, writing emergency grant proposals, running Zoom benefits, soliciting donations, constantly trying to access the emergency aid that is available via websites that continuously crash. They've managed to survive, but they acknowledge that they're lucky ones, and that and as Lisa said, like, it's the unknowing, it's the not knowing how long this will be and what will happen, that's really becoming a huge emotional burden. For the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, emergency grants and loans and donations from supporters have helped, but those are a drop in the bucket, realistically. So, you know, the infrastructure that we've created for helping these organizations, all small organizations, even businesses of any kind, the safety nets are just slow, Byzantine, and opaque, if not contradictory. So that's one issue. The community gardens, so who knows what will happen, but being nimble is one thing, but there really are going to be waves of impact economically. And I think a lot of places are worried about not necessarily 2020, but what about 2021 and thereafter? What will state budgets look like? What are arts agencies going to look like in those state budgets? Philadelphia's already talked about cutting their Office of Culture and Creative Economy entirely. And in New York, the State Senate member Jose Serrano from the 29th District has already put a bill forward, Senate Bill S7274B, which proposes an historic business preservation registry that is in correlation with the state register, which falls under the rubric sort of the national parks of the National Register. And it's an act to amend the Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Law in relation to establishing this registry that requires, as historic preservation does, a 50-year tenure in a community to be eligible, which is really challenging, as we know, for a lot of communities in New York that have called this place home and make it the rich, vital place that it is. 50 years is just not realistic, and also doesn't reflect waves of migration and opportunity and gentrification. So that's something that I'm thinking about right now, and I'm wondering how that will change. Community gardens have been in a protracted battle with the city since Giuliani. They have been in a long battle with Green Thumb for the last year over new licenses that a lot of gardeners perceive as having regulations and laws and restrictions that are really onerous and in a lot of ways putative to the community garden movement. At the same time, gardens, this city just adopted a new law, Local Law 46, that was it'll be officially enacted in September, that recategorizes gardens from being vacant lots on Pluto, the primary land use tax lot output database, to open space, which is a huge step forward. But, you know, parking lots are also categorized as open space. These are not categorized as green space. And for so many communities, this is the only access that they have to a gathering space, a fresh light, fresh food, air. It's important for young people, health and environmental education, environmental, advocacy and sustainability. And of course, it's also very different from one neighborhood to another. Access to public space and the commons is something I'm very concerned about with all of this. Thinking specifically also about the Giglio Festival, Pride, the West Indian American Day Carnival. How are communities going to be able to come together to use the commons, to use public space, to celebrate their identity, to celebrate achievements, to make their presences felt, when we already know and have seen, sadly, very recently, how very differently access to resources, city support, police support, permits, et cetera, have played out even in this pandemic, from neighborhood to neighborhood, from community to community. And I think we're all really worried about how that's going to look in terms of events like this that are already receiving an unequal amount of support and attention and criticism from the city and outsiders. So that's sort of the things I'm thinking about with these three different typologies for after this.
Great, thanks, Molly. Zulmalina, if you could also address the question of how you see things evolving in the future for your work in East New York.
Yeah, so right now for East New York, the priority is about preserving lives, not about preserving buildings at the moment. So, our neighborhood is currently dealing with more critical issues, homelessness, unemployment, and deaths, so it feels like, preserving East New York would be competing for attention. And, it's almost like we will be starting, we kind of lost a little bit of the stamina, since we've started in 2015, the way that we work is to progressively, and patiently engage the community through education, and slowly, through our work, get them to understand, the meaning of preservation, and hopefully, convert them into becoming community preservationists. So right now it feels like, we will be starting over again this process, after all these critical issues that have, that have risen. So it's almost like, I'll say, like it's almost like, planting a seed and seeing seeing it sprout and seeing the little bit of growth, and we haven't been able to water it because of things that are, you know, that are out of control at the moment. So I see the future of Penny, you know, moving forward, but at a slower pace.
Movie one is a nice one.
So now if we could have Simeon address the same question.
We will once again, I've been muted. Have I been muted?
It sounds like Simeon is
Perspective and the policy results that could happen as we attempt to recover from the economic repercussions of what's going on. That what might be happening is that we will be seeing a real swing towards a lack of regulation in attempts to kind of recreate and restart the economy. One of the concerns that we have is to sort of come out of this crisis with as much paint preservationists as being against new things, and one of the elements that that's going to be happening is the need to start construction to bring that back. However, we are worried that a lot of our regulations, particularly in this political environment, will be abandoned. I'm going to stop speaking now.
Okay, thanks, Simeon. Sorry for the audio issues. Angel, can you also address the question of how you see the future, both for your specific work and then more broadly for the preservation field?
Sure. I mean, for us, we are a small firm, so preservation and architectural firms in general, they're small businesses. They grow, they shrink, and they always accommodate their size according to the economics ups and downs, and that literally means more or less employment for architects. And this is a phase where we're not, fortunately not at our office, but because we're a really small firm, we'll be able to thrive through, and I hope. I think we have also the capabilities to do work on the exterior and work on interiors, like some firms that can only do one type of thing. And I think that's an advantage of as a small practice. So I hope, I wish that we will be able to thrive through the crisis while remaining small and smart. And I think that's our advantage. There will continue to be work. The safety work, all the facade safety work will continue. So firms who do that will continue to be busy doing so. I think really the challenge is what will happen from the advocacy perspective in the preservation world, where none of us have a magic ball, but I think that we could tell that based on our experience, we understand how the thrive of New York and what makes it a really compelling place is it's this constant wrestling between preservation and development and so on. But I think it is clear based on what I'm seeing, what we're reading, what I've been discussing with colleagues and clients in the real estate industry, is that I think we're headed for some type of a crisis in the real estate industry that we don't know exactly what that means and what will it be and what the real impact is. But what is really clear is that there's a whole bunch of unsold luxury apartments that really doesn't really make a lot of sense to continue to build. So probably, fortunately, the talk of the rise of the super tower may have just come to sort of like a stop of its own, at least in the residential sector. That may continue to happen on the commercial sector. And I was just reading today in the real estate news that there are news about like the third iteration for the super toll that a major developer is proposing across the street from the station. And what that really means is that if due to the financing, due to the change in the office world, where maybe people will be working from home more, and I think this is here to stay, and it's not going to go anywhere. And I think that maybe because of the need to space people in offices and so on, the way in which the office environment will change, the real estate market will change as well. And I think that with retail going down in general, I think, and the increasing retail vacancies will increase. And all of that to me reads real estate crisis. And if that were to happen, what that means is also that then if they cannot focus on the super big developments and however residential development considered to be an attractive pursue and profit-making possibility in New York City, my biggest concern, and some of the concerns we've been sharing and in Safe Harlem now, is that this may lead that there will be increased pressures, real estate pressures on low-rise neighborhoods like Harlem, like Central Harlem, that are underprotected, that don't have the benefit of having vast historic districts that are subject to at least the purview of the Land Mass Preservation Commission, however imperfect it may be. But when you have now that combination of neighborhoods that are going to be on the low-rise neighborhoods that are going to be under increased real estate pressures, combined with the issues that we were talking about before, that those are the same neighborhoods where you have disadvantaged communities have been largely impacted by the virus. And as Sue Milena was saying also, and I mentioned based on what my experience in what's happening in Safe Harlem now, where this nascent advocacy efforts that are in these neighborhoods have pretty much come to a stop because there's been a shift on survival. I think there is a really vulnerable situation that will emerge and become apparent probably just as soon as we all go back to work, that I think it will be a major threat. So I think that preservation and preservation advocacy at the neighborhood level, putting up the good fights, is something that will be even more important after this crisis, because the increased real estate pressures that I think could be anticipated that will take place. There will be just a lot of funding where they may just be more, that may be more interested in the smaller investments than in the super tall buildings or in the mid-sized building. I think that's an issue that will have to really be taken into account. And I think the other important issue that we will have to wrestle with as a community is that the Energy Conservation Code is going to change in a matter of weeks or less than a week, I think, which really means that the Climate Mobilization Act is really becoming law. And what that really means is that a lot of buildings greater than 25,000 square feet will have to be severely transformed to comply with the new requirements of the Climate Mobilization Act. And I think that as a community, the preservation community, we still have to figure out what that means. There's a lot of buildings out there that are more than 25,000 square feet that are not designated and do not have the same level of landmark protections that all the buildings that will be affected. And I'm thinking about the stuff that I deal with in my book in terms of reglazing modernism, modern buildings that are really vulnerable to this issue of energy conservation and energy improvement. So all that to say that I think this is the other major field where I think that preservation will have to play a big role in terms of how do we honor the very much needed energy conservation changes, the lowering of emissions, and the implementation of these very important plans that we have in place without throwing the baby out of the window with the water by retrofitting buildings in a way that may, to some extent, have an impact on their historic character. That is a topic that I'm fascinated about, and I think that we still, as a community, will still have to figure out what that means. And I think that probably what will happen is that only once we're getting into 2020, 2022, 23, 24, when the first deadlines start to appear and we start to see really alterations on buildings. Now, under the code require necessities of addressing climate change, we may be dealing with alterations on buildings that may not be desirable, may not be appropriate, even if from a preservation perspective, even if they're done from a code-compliant energy conservation perspective. And I think that's an important topic that as architects and preservationists and advocates, we all have to really roll up our sleeves and try to figure out what it means and put up our guard and prevent changes that we may want to, otherwise we may have to lament.
Great, thank you, Angel. Lisa asked for a brief moment to respond to something that Molly raised in her comments. So I want to give Lisa a minute to make the additional comment that she had before we transition into some Q&A and wrap up the panel.
Great. I mean, Molly mentioned that we don't know what state budgets will look like. And I just wanted to say, you know, I think we do know what city, state, and even federal budgets are going to look like. If you don't have the same tax revenue, the state budgets become decimated fairly quickly. I think that's, you know, predictable and cyclical. I think what really, you know, when Molly said that, what it made me think was we're so used to weathering that storm, but it's the private philanthropy that I worry about more, because there's going to be such a pressure on philanthropists to look at COVID-specific responses. And you can see it now already with, you know, a lot of emergency funds that are pouring in, which is fantastic. There's going to be a pull to, you know, get people who give general contributions to redirect them to medical research, all good. But there's a finite amount of dollars out there. And you just worry that preservation, certain cultural activities, even education, sadly, are going to suffer in that. And the other comment Molly made was about the San Giglio Festival and the Caribbean Day Parade. And, you know, we appreciate them for their cultural offerings, but they are also money makers. So when you remove street activities, whether it's festivals or parades, you also continue to erode that base of support that can often exist. So, you know, I thought Molly's point was so good, but I just wanted to, you know, take 1 minute to reinforce that that's really the heart and soul of where a lot of the anxiety for us is.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about the current challenges that all of you are facing and the ones that you anticipate facing in the, you know, sort of slightly longer term, medium term. But to kind of turn it to a more hopeful note to hopefully end on before we get to Q&A from our attendees, I'd like each of you to just really quickly, sort of a lightning round, talk about what you hope comes out of this situation and what you hope historic preservation looks like, and how you hope your work grows and helps the city to recover from this in the way that preservationists have often helped this city respond during previous crises, whether economic or other things that have impacted our city. So if each of you, and I'll go through the list again, I'll start with Lisa. If you could just address what you hope comes out of this for preservation.
Oh gosh, well, I hate that my last name begins with A, I guess, but I hope it sparks a certain kind of creativity. And I guess because preservation is often seen as a luxury activity, I hope that this reinforces for people that preservation is not some side activity, that it's very much knit into how we live our lives and how we experience the space around us, and that preservation is just an appreciation of how the past intersects with today. So I hope we all learn and grow a little bit in positive ways for the preservation field.
Great, thanks. Molly, your quick response to that?
Yeah, I would say on like a macro level, I hope we don't go back to the way things were before, because things were not working for many people before. And to go back to normal wasn't good in terms of beyond preservation, just generally, politically, socially, economically, in terms of our criminal justice system and everything. We need an overhaul. And the way that this has impacted specific communities, particularly disadvantaged communities of color, is really makes all of that very laid bare, and we can't deny it, and we shouldn't, and we need to change. So going back to normal is what I hope we don't do, whatever normal looked like before. And in terms of preservation, something that we've been thinking about, and somebody in the chat, addressed this, I think thinking about preservation, conservation more holistically, and thinking about it in terms of tangible cultural heritage and traditional practices, and thinking about beyond style and bricks and mortar, how we preserve cultural or conserve culture and support culture. And I think something we've been working on is the idea of pushing the boundaries of preservation, the 50-year cutoff, a lot with the concept of integrity, which is kind of loaded to begin with, and the idea of traditional cultural properties, which is a designation criteria for the national and state registers that suggest an ongoing significance for sites rather than a bounded time frame. So that's something I think we should be pushing.
Great. Zilmalina?
Yeah. Hi. So I feel like now that the economy is shifting, I hope that historic buildings are seen as a valuable and crucial resource, for development. Instead of knocking down buildings, people will have to use existing buildings to provide, the affordable housing, bring those jobs, through preservation. Those are the things that I hope that, people will start looking at preservation as something, that it has to be part of life, and moving forward.
Great. Simeon?
Third time's the charm. I would like to actually see preservation come out of this stronger than ever, that what we do in the preservation business is talk about what is truly valuable to the city, to the culture. And one of the things that unfortunately we're dealing with as a people, all being locked inside with our dodgy internet connections and irritating house pets, we're missing things. And we're missing our city, and we're missing being together, but we're also missing the physical environments that we haven't seen. And I would like to see, when we finally get to go out again and be with each other, I don't want to see those things disappear. And I want to see us to be strengthened and to say, wow, it's all still here and it's going to remain here. And we know more than ever that these places are important to us. So how can we best protect them, and what can be put into place right now to protect them? I also echo what people were saying about the cultural, the inherent cultural value of places. How many of those of the restaurants and bars and theaters have closed because of the economic ramifications plus New York City pause? I want to see them reopen again, and I want to see them protected. I don't want to see Near's Tavern closed because of transitory economic problems. I would like to see programs put into place that will help protect these things during the crests and waves of normal economies. Finally, I would like to say, I'd like to see people being put to work to survey what we have now. That there's going to be a lot of people, we're going to have to put a lot of people back to work. And one of the things I think that would be great to do would to get a real sense of the physical universe that we're living in. During the Great Depression, there was the WPA tax photo program, and I would love, and then that was redone again in the 1980s, and it's been 40 years. I think it's time to redo that.
Great. Thanks, Simeon. Angel?
Yeah, good question. I have to echo a lot of what has been said, and in particular some of the things that Simeon just said. We've always said that preservation is about people. So I think a better preservation feel, a better preservation environment after COVID-19 would be a realization that there is a very important connection between people and the places that they live, go to work, have fun, and so on. I think that to some extent, it's easier to disconnect. It's easy for people to feel a little bit remoted to places that they don't belong to, or places that they are only living temporarily. But I think, you know, comes 7 o'clock and everybody is on the window in my neighborhood and making noises and creating a sense of community and coming together as a community to salute, to respect those who are really on the front line. So I think that a strengthened community that at a level that we're seeing here and what's happening at 7 o'clock, where people are really coming together for a common cause, it's something that we all feel related to. I think it's an aspiration because I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, the preservation is about people's connection to a place. I think it's important to remind people with the things that they're missing, that they've been missing, and why it's so awful and depressing to look at those views of the city deployed of its more valuable asset, which is the people. I go to my office every week, once a week at least, to pick up mail and so on. And for much that, I think it's just amazing that it takes me 20 minutes to drive to Midtown from Clinton Hill, and that I can drive and just sail through it and park on Fifth Avenue. And I have the privilege of just doing that in a private car. I have to say that it's really depressing. It's just a city full of everything you know, but it's missing the people, right? So I think it would be an important aspiration to just try to harvest this energy, harvest this kind of feeling for what people felt that have left behind in terms of communities, and remind people and use preservation as one kind of as a tool that kind of remind people how they belong to those places and how those places really made their life better in so many ways. My wife and my daughter right now are in our community garden, so that I have the luxury of being quiet here while I'm having this conversation. It really means that community garden is an extremely important place for us, and it is for other people. I was with my daughter, I took her to Prospect Park on Sunday, and it was amazing to see that place where people were still trying to practice social distance and so on, but there was a sense of place. This was a place where people had a chance to go out, take some fresh air, and do some just take a break from being at home for so long. So I think we have to figure out a way to harvest those connections from people to place and make it work and put it to a good outcome in terms of having everyone understand and remember the meaning of these many places to our lives and why people have chosen to live here or just happen to live here, but how this place is defined by those places and now we miss. And that they do have value, and as those places change and become something else, those memories are gone. Those experiences are something that something of the past, and it's something that should not just be lost, but to some extent preserved. So I'm optimistic that we can, I don't know how, figure out a way to harvest this kind of energy that I see at 7 o'clock at night every night, and that I see in the way that people are relating to each other, to strengthen our communities and to try to preserve the places that matter to us, which is not just one building or the other one, but what make the many pieces that make the whole.
Great. Thank you, Angel. I think what we're going to do right now is we're going to launch our poll, and it's about 5 short questions, and we'd love, while you're doing that, to also ask you to write your questions in the Q&A. And if you'd like to, you can ask a question to a specific panelist, or you can ask a question that would be for everybody on the panel. That's up to you, but we'd love to hear from you, both to take your time to answer our short poll, which will really be helpful to us, and to hear from you for your questions. So we'll give you a moment to do that, and then we'll move on to our Q&A section before we wrap up.
And we have one question from that's been in the chat for a little while, and it's a question about whether some of our historic sites could incorporate video tours to give a virtual experience during this period when people can't physically attend, and whether that's a potential revenue source for them. And any of our panelists can answer that, but maybe Lisa, as chair of the Historic House Trust, is that something that the trust has looked into, and is that something that you think is a viable way to help protect some of our vulnerable historic sites?
Well, I think what's interesting is a wealth of sites, both in the United States and abroad, have put up in the last few weeks virtual tours. So I think you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of virtual tours of sites. The National Trust of Historic Preservation here in the US and the National Trust in the UK have both sent out several emails highlighting virtual tours that are available. Here in New York City, Historic House Trust itself hasn't put up virtual tours, but the individual nonprofits that run the individual houses, not all of them, but a good selection of them have put up virtual tours and some additional materials, just other educational offerings. They're recognizing everybody is struggling, looking for activities for kids. So they've put up things from how to grow a kitchen garden with scraps, to tour the house, to hear some interesting Swiss cottage marionette fits. And so there's a wealth of materials. In terms of the ability for that to raise money, right now, most of the content is being offered for free. And I think, it's a question because a lot of people resent when certain kind of content isn't free on the internet. But I think as we move through then looking at the future, and as Molly said, we're not going to go back to normal as it was. We're going to go back to something. But, I think some people will look to perhaps see if you can put some things behind a paywall, have some stuff that's free, and find other alternatives. Right now, people have just felt a need to offer things to people and also to stay in people's consciousness. So right now, at least from my perspective, all of the content I've seen has been free.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And there was a question also from a little while ago from Jane. saying that listening to the panel, it looks as if we need to expand the definition of historic preservation to include cultural preservation, preservation of important sites that are not necessarily architecturally significant places and spaces, but the ones that give neighborhoods character and provide important culturally important sites. And then she just asked a follow-up question to that about how do we do that politically? So we know we have a very robust Landmarks Preservation Commission and a robust set of tools that have been used fairly effectively to preserve a certain typology of building, a certain type of neighborhood, a certain type of district very well. But clearly there are gaps, and I think we're seeing that now. So whoever among the panelists would like to tackle that question, feel free.
I think one of the questions here is, what do we mean by preserve? In New York City, we're gifted with a remarkably good landmarks law, but that's only one tool. If you're trying to preserve the look of an area, that has to do with the scale, the materials that are used, the basic design, there could be zoning. There isn't in New York City, but there could potentially be zoning that did that. If you are attempting to preserve, the ethnic character of a neighborhood, the classic issue being, for example, the Lower East Side, as if there's one classic Lower East Side and not a dozen or more Lower East Sides that cycled through people's memories. I very much agree, and I think that what we need to do is, coming at from a preservation perspective, which is really a place-based way of looking at the world, we need to recognize more of the vernacular and community context history, and continue to build on that specific significance of places, be they whole neighborhoods, be they one or two specific anchor points, that require a bit of explanation if you're not part of that community. If we could manage to somehow preserve their physical character, I think we would be doing a very good job.
So we have I think, time for only one more question, Chris. There's another interesting question from Peter in the chat, specifically from Mali and Zumalina. And he says, I thought it's interesting that some examples that you both brought up deal with the human interactive community, and obviously during this pandemic we can't really have that. I was wondering if you both have begun to work on some analysis on how to use architecture to deal with this situation, and if so, what could that be? Additionally, how much of the inability for interaction hurts economically for those communities especially? So that's particularly, he was wondering for Mali and Zumalina if you might have a response to that question. Are you muted, Zumalina?
No. I'm not. I was just processing the question.
Got it.
Yeah, reading and processing the question. I mean, yeah, a lot of the work that we do is, face to face. And right now we're just thinking about, what would that look like at the moment, because we have to think about the future now without that face-to-face interaction. You have our community varies, and our, the pool of people, they'll have, what is it? They vary from ages, and the younger crowd, they're connected to technology versus the older crowd, they're not. So, while we're here inside, we still do our work, our advocacy work of sharing these historical places of our community online. But what happens to that other crowd that doesn't have internet access? Because, not everybody is lucky to have the resources at the moment to engage with the online community. So, you know, in terms of like the economic factor, you know, right now, Preserving East New York is a small group, and we all volunteer our time, and we don't make any revenue out of our work. And you know, our work is possible through grants from Citizens Committee and from the Historic Districts Council Six to Celebrate program. So right now, economically, we're not affected. We will be affected when we try to reach out, you know, to get grants, and you know, who knows if these grants will later be available to us, since you know all the focus has been allocated to, you know, COVID related responses. So
Great.
mhm.
Thanks, Melina.
You're welcome.
So this is, there's one last, seems like more of a comment than a question, but I think it's a good one. John has posted a comment saying, preservation speaks to the language of community and society. The pandemic has changed our personal outlook from self toward community and support for others, rather than just making sure we as individuals stay in survivor mode. We're more likely to help others today than 2 months ago. This should be seen as an advantage for preservation. So I think that's a good sort of positive note to end on. One other thing that we did want to mention before we wrap up the panel is the New York State Historic Preservation Office, the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, is now gearing up to start the planning process for the next 5-year state historic preservation plan. So the National Park Service requires that every state in the country, every 5 years, prepare a new state preservation plan. And so our state is about to launch the planning process for the 2021 to 2025 state preservation plan. So we wanted to just take a moment to encourage everybody to participate in that. The folks who are here who are interested in this topic of what does preservation look like in the future, post-pandemic, in our city and across our state, should really engage in that process. There are multiple ways to become involved, surveys and outreach. And if you are a practitioner, if you are a preservationist, if you're working in a community, please do get involved in that, because that is really the plan that sets the vision for our state for the next 5 years around preservation issues. So it's really critically important that everybody take some time and get involved. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rebecca to wrap up.
We just want to say to all of our panelists, thank you so much. You all have such an incredible amount of knowledge and thoughtful ideas of what to do in the situation. And I wish that we had more time to probe and to ask questions to follow up. But we are so grateful that you joined us this evening, and for all of you who came to listen and participate in this panel. On behalf of the School of Architecture at Pratt Institute and AIA Brooklyn, we're just very glad that you joined us. And we're grateful for your feedback. If you have not given that in the poll, please take a moment to do so. And we hope to be in touch with you and to see you at future events. And thank you again, and have a good evening, all of you.
Thank you.
Class dismissed for us.
Unless you want to stay on for a moment.
Tell us.
Yeah, just stay on for just a second, and then we can go. I guess we can go. I just wanted to make sure to say thank you to all of you and for your time. I really appreciate it. It was really fascinating and interesting. So thank you all for joining us. I hope we get to see you in real life soon.
Yes, I want to add my thanks to the speakers. You guys were great. This was very interesting, and I'm really glad we were able to do this. I'll let you know when we have the video recording available, and it will eventually be posted on Pratt's website. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Vicki.
Good night, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now.
All right. Good night.
All right. Good night. Thank
Night
you.
all.
Good night.